So at this point, we are going to actually start learning a little bit about HTML, which is one of the most basic building blocks of building out a website or a web application. And in this tutorial, I'm going to be using VS Code, which is an IDE, which stands for Integrated Developer Environment. It's really just a fancy term for a text editor, but it has a lot of plugins and features that you can use to kind of facilitate your abilities to write code. So I highly recommend that you download this so that you can maybe follow along in this tutorial with me. I am not going to show you how to download this and install this. I hope you have enough tech knowledge to double click an installer and run through a wizard and get it installed. But once you do have it installed, I'm going to show you a little bit about it, because I'm going to talk about some of these different sections in VS Code, and then I'm going to start talking about HTML. So skip forward if you already know like VS Code and how to use an editor. But in a nutshell, you have on the left here, you have like your main features of VS Code. This is like your file explorer, which is very similar to, using like my computer on Windows or the Finder on Mac, where you can dive into your hard drive and find different files and folders. This is probably going to be your most important view that you're going to be looking at, because you often need to like dive around into different files and open up different directories and stuff like that. The other four, I'm just going to quickly glance over, but I'm not going to go into detail because we're not going to use them until you get more advanced. This is a search panel. This allows you to search your whole project for a particular keyword. This is something for GitHub and source control, which we are not going to talk about. This is a debugger, which we are actually going to use a lot, probably as you're learning how to code in JavaScript. So I'll talk about this later on in this series, but don't worry about this right now. And then finally, the extensions. There's a lot of cool extensions you can install to help improve your programming experience. But for the most part, I'm not going to really cover these unless I'm using something that I think you all need to also use, maybe like a linter or a formatter. But again, those are just terms that I'm not going to really cover right now. So let's talk about the File Explorer. I hope you've seen something like this before, but basically it is a way to manage a directory. Okay, so on your computer, on your hard disk, you have folders, and in those folders you have files and more folders. So for an example, if I wanted to add a new file, for example, like an index HTML file, I can either right click on this panel here and click new file, or I can click on this icon with the plus here to create a new file. And at that point, you can type in like index HTML, press enter, and that's going to open up your file here. So you can continuously make files. You can make folders here. So if I make a folder called like source, I could click and drag files into my source folder and then drag them back out if I want to. It's pretty easy, and it's pretty self-explanatory if you've already used like a file explorer on your operating system. But we are going to try to also talk about this panel here. So this is the main code editing panel. This is where you can actually see the code to your file. It's super important to get familiar with this. Some things I like to do is I like to do a split panel. So if you ever see me do this in a tutorial, this is me clicking command \, which will basically split the panel into two horizontally so that I can kind of look at two files at the same time and not have to switch back and forth. This is more like, you might not use this if you're a beginner, but as you start becoming intermediate, you're probably going to use this a lot, or I recommend that you use this a lot. And then there's some other like quick ways that you can close files, like command W will close this file. But click on it, it should open it back up. There is one thing that's kind of strange with VS Code. There's like a preview mode. If you just installed VS Code, your settings might be set up so that you have to double click the file to keep it like locked into your tabs. But if I make another file here, I'm going to say like other.html, you can actually open up two files at once and easily switch between them like this, okay? So we're going to be seeing that a lot as well in this video, where we kind of like go through different files. Because remember, I talked about how an application, as it grows in size, you're going to be creating more and more source files and then importing them in from like a main source file, I guess I could say. By the way, you can also do split panel by clicking on this little button up here. If you hover over it, it tells you what the keyboard shortcut is. So just keep that in mind if you wanted to try to do that, but you can't find the shortcut. All right, so the last section I want to talk about real quick is the terminal down here. So when you're doing like the debugger, this terminal will open up, and usually you'll have like the debug console tab clicked on. But it's important to, when we get later on and more advanced, that you understand how to use the terminal. And this can be kind of overwhelming and daunting at first because there's no like there's no interaction. You can't use your mouse and click on anything. It's all command line. But the main idea is that there's different commands that you can run in your terminal to do different things. Like for example, pwd prints out your parent working directory. So this tells me that my VS Code is opened up to this folder. You can also dive into subfolders using the cd command. I'll cover these later on if we actually use them, but I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information. So for right now, I just want you to be familiar. If this little panel pops up, you're not like, what the heck is this? It's just a terminal that allows you to type in commands to do stuff at a lower level on your operating system. So for right now, I'm going to close that, and we are going to focus on writing some HTML. So if you remember, like I said, like when you load up your browser and you go to a URL, you're going to fetch an HTML file, okay? The HTML file is a language, a markup language that describes how the browser should render to its screen, right? So it tells you like, where to put these different elements on the screen, how to display them, how to style them, how to add interactivity. And usually the HTML file is like your main file of the program. This is where you start importing JavaScript and importing third-party libraries. This is where you import your style sheet. And basically this is like the controller, right? This controls everything in your application. And then from there, you can dive into other files to see like how stuff is working. So in order to get started with HTML, we need to first talk about tags, okay? So the HTML language is created by using a bunch of different tags, which are basically just keywords that describe like what different elements should do in the browser. So one tag you might see is the HTML tag. So like this. So notice in VS Code, when I typed in HTML and press enter, it automatically closed my ending tag. Now, I don't know if that's a setting in VS Code. If it is, let me know in the comments. It's really easy to set up. But everything in HTML is built off of tags. And more specifically, there's these opening and closing brackets that describe when a tag starts and when a tag ends. So to kind of do some more introspection on this, you see that the ending tag is always going to have this /, all right? So it's going to be a less than sign, a / HTML, and a greater than sign. This is just the syntax of HTML, and you kind of just have to get used to it and memorize how this works. But if you just allow VS Code to kind of do the work for you, it's actually pretty straightforward, okay? So just keep that in mind. We got every tag has an opening tag and an ending tag. And something that you might see also is we sometimes just automatically close tags. You'll see this with like inputs. So I'll do like an input. Sometimes you'll see this. I personally don't like doing this. I rather just make sure everything is explicit and you have like an opening tag and a closing tag for every element. But let's just take a step back. I'm kind of getting into the weeds here. Let's start with the first tag. So if you remember, I talked about how like HTML builds up a tree structure. Well, it turns out that your root node, that grandma node that I kind of talked about in the last video, is your HTML tag. So this is usually what you need to put at the very outer of your HTML file. And then inside of it, you can start nesting other children or other elements or other tags. So let's actually dive down a little bit further. Typically in an HTML file, we have a head and we have a body. So let's just put a head tag, just like that. And inside the head tag is where you can actually start loading in some other scripts, right? So like, let's say you're using a CSS library called Bootstrap. Well, this is where you probably want to load it in. Or if you want to load in some JavaScript files, you could also load it in here. There are some caveats about loading in JavaScript files, and sometimes you need to put it in the body tag. But for the most part, the head tag is for fetching other files and having the HTML kind of execute those files. And then also you can put like meta tags so that, for example, when Google Chrome is crawling your website, it knows exactly what this page is trying to do. So you can put like meta tags to say like this is a blog post or this is a blog about JavaScript, stuff like that. But that's more advanced. We aren't going to focus too much on that. Okay, so let's move on to the next tag that is typically always nested inside the HTML element. Okay, so this is the body tag. This is the fundamental structure of a basic HTML file. There's some stuff that I'm missing that would help it be more valid, but these are basically the tags that you need to write a valid HTML file. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to save this. And I'm going to go over to Chrome and try to open up this file just to see if we're kind of on the right path. So going over to the Chrome, I can make a new tab. I can click Open, and then I can go to my workspace, and I can go to where I'm doing this. I don't know what I called this folder, full stack something. So if I load up the full stack folder here and click on my index file, you can actually open this right in your browser, right? You don't need to host this on a web server, at least yet. There are some security things set in the Chrome where you can't load an HTML file that's like fetching other libraries, but for the most part, if you're just learning, this is a good way to do it. So let's just kind of zoom in a little bit so that you can see what's going on. I'm going to move this over to the right so that my head is not blocking it. Can you all see that? I hope you can. All right, so you can see here, again, I kind of showed you this in the other video, but this is the exact HTML that we created in that file, and our Chrome browser is rendering it. Now, it turns out that there's nothing really going on here because we didn't put any text or anything else special inside this file, but this is a start to a good file. So let's kind of dive in further of like what we can do with HTML. We talked about the HTML tag, we talked about the head tag and the body tag. Although I don't think I actually talked about the body that much. The body tag is where you're going to put like all your content. So if you have like a blog post or a blog page, this is where you want to put your title. You maybe want to put like your top level header, your navigation. All of that is going to go inside your body tag. And this is just the convention we use for HTML, right? You don't necessarily have to put stuff in the body tag. Like I could put text here and save it and notice that it's going to show up on the page. But to do it properly, you see here, I think Chrome actually just adds a body tag for you by default, but the proper way to do it is to actually have a body tag, and then you can start typing in some text like this. All right, so to help make this process easier for you all to learn, I'm going to combine my Chrome and my VS Code on the same screen. All right, and then I'm going to close out this file navigator because at this point, we don't really need it that much. All right, so let me zoom out a little bit. By the way, you'll see me switch my dev tools from being like on the right side and being down at the bottom, just depending on if I'm trying to do like some type of responsive design or something. But just keep that in mind. You click this drop down here, these three dots, and you can change it to how you want it to be and do whatever works for you, depending on what your setup is. But because my head's blocking the left side, I'm going to try to do this. All right, so let us look at some more tags, okay? HTML is all about learning and memorizing these different tags you can use. One of the tags you can actually use is called a title. So the title tag is another element that you can basically put some text in, and that'll change up here the title of your tab, okay? So if you look at here, it says index.html. Let's say we wanted to name that like my awesome tutorial. And if I click save and refresh my page, notice that the title up here changes to my awesome tutorial. So that's pretty cool. There's also like a fave icon we can import if we wanted to change that. We're not going to get into that right now. But there's just a lot of different tags you can use. In fact, there's a lot that I don't know about, but feel free to look them up. I'll be honest with you all, there's like 100 or so tags, but you really only ever end up using like 9 or 10 of them, right? So don't feel overwhelmed if you're reading through like a site that lists all the tags because you're not going to use all of them. You're just going to use a small subset. But let's just keep on diving in. I'm going to show you the ones that I feel like are most important for a beginner. And then if you find something new, just go read about it and learn it a little bit for yourself. So for the body, let's actually start talking about some other types of tags. So there's a lot of tags you can use to build out your website. And well, the first one I'm going to talk about is the paragraph tag, okay? The paragraph tag is a way to basically set up logical paragraphs in your website. So for example, if you are doing like a blog post, you might have different paragraphs in your post that you want to separate with like new lines. So let me just find something called lorem ipsum. Lorem ipsum, go here. This is just basically some text that a lot of people use to just put into the website so that you can actually like visualize what it might look. So here we have some lorem ipsum, and what I'm going to show you here is that it's just a p tag that has some nested text for its child, okay? So let's copy and paste this a couple of times and save that, and you'll notice that now we have 2 paragraph tags in our HTML document here. So this is basically what you can do to basically build out, blog websites or separate your content by paragraphs. So this is an important tag. I'm not going to dive into like too much detail about all these tags Because honestly, you can kind of build a website just using the div tag for everything, except for like a couple of inputs and stuff. But that's the paragraph tag. All right, so let me just kind of reduce this a little bit. And I'm going to talk about some other tags that sometimes people use. There is a B tag, which can be used for making some text bold. So if I wanted to make that I inside in bold, you can see that it kind of made it bold here if you squint your eyes and look really close. This is just another tag to memorize. There's also an I tag, so I could do I, and I could wrap like a word with the I tag, and that'll make it italicized. Italicized, did I pronounce that correctly? People argue that you shouldn't be using these tags anymore because this is like styling, that you should just use maybe like a strong tag. Like there's a strong tag that you can use, which does like basically the same thing. But I'm just trying to show you that the whole concept of HTML is you make tags and you just nest things in them, okay? And again, I'm not going to cover every single tag, so if there's something I don't cover in this video, don't get mad. It's super easy to do a Google search and just learn a new tag for yourself. So some of the other important tags that are used all the time are called title tags or header tags. So if I type in H1 here and type in like my awesome tutorial and click save, notice that that adds some text on my page that's really large, and it also has like some padding underneath it or margin. I haven't talked about what margin and padding is. I'll do that when I get to CSS. But just using the H1 tag and the P tag, you can actually build out a really basic like site, okay? So it turns out you can actually do H1 through H6. So if I were to change H1 to H2, it's going to slowly shrink the text. It's still going to remain bold, but it's going to shrink it. So H3 looks like that. H4 looks like that. H5 looks like that. And H6 kind of looks like that. So you might ask, okay, when do I use an H1 through an H2 and H6? That really all comes down to like the content that you're writing. Typically, when you hit a website, you want H1s to be like your most important headers or titles. And then if you have any like subsections of a blog post or a site, you might want to use H2 or H3s. Really, there's no hard or soft rule for any of this stuff. I think for accessibility, so that's a term basically meaning that like people who have impaired vision or hearing, who can't necessarily use a website as well as others, or maybe don't have good hands because of deformity, usually they use something called like a screen reader, or they use like a keyboard to navigate through your website. And there's certain tags that you want to use to allow people with disabilities to easily navigate your website. So accessibility is something really important to kind of understand, but as a beginner, it's a whole nother like subject. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, but just keep it in mind that the way that you use certain tags and the way that you structure your elements can really affect other people who happen to be disabled. All right, so let's talk about the next type of tag. So I'm going to copy this cat image and we're going to try to get it displayed here. So there is a tag called IMG, which stands for image. So if I type out image and press enter, actually I might use the backtick here. This is a special tag, right? So this tag actually requires something called an attribute. We haven't talked about attributes yet, but that is something that you can actually attach to the DOM element itself to make it do different things. So in this case, the image tag requires a source attribute. So if I type SRS, which is shorthand for source, type in equals, type in some double quotes, and paste in a URL of an image, that is how you can have an image display on your website, okay? This is a new concept, attributes and stuff, but we're going to use these a lot down the road. Just memorize the syntax. It's just the name of your attribute with an equal sign, and then you set that equal to a what we call a string. So something that's in double quotes. And I'm sorry that this is kind of going off the page here, but it's fine. It's just a URL, right? There's also some other attributes you can attach to an image tag since we're kind of on that subject. You notice here this cat image is like gigantic. What if we wanted to make it a little bit smaller? Well, we could say like width of 100 and save that. And notice that the cat image kind of scaled down. So that kind of helps us out a little bit. You can also embed images inside of your paragraph tags as well. So if I were to paste this like right here in between this text, notice that it shows up just nested in the text. It doesn't look that great, but there are ways to kind of put images inside of text. So if you're ever lost when it comes to like dealing with tags and like what you could potentially attach to them, I recommend just searching it. Just use Google and search. Like I just did a search for the image tag and I went to w3schools.com. And this is a list of all the different attributes you can attach to an image and then what they do and like what you need to pass them. Notice here, this says source. This is exactly what we just passed here. They also have width here, but they have some other things that you may use or you may not use. Alt tag is something that is really useful for like hovering over. Again, I think it's for accessibility that you can hover over an image and it tells you exactly what it is, because imagine someone who's blind using your website and then they come across an image of a cat, but it doesn't actually say anything, right? So alt tags are important too. Maybe just describe like what the image does. So if you hover over it, at least I thought that's what you can do. I don't know. There's some things about programming I just honestly forget. I don't know. Just keep that in mind that I don't know everything about web development. I do know a lot, but I don't know everything. But I do remember that I used to be able to hover over images and it would tell me exactly like with a pop-up what the alt tag is. I don't know if Chrome's changed or if I'm doing it wrong, but I think the alt tag is pretty important to put some text associated with that image. All right, so what other tags should we talk about, right? There's no shame. I kind of Googled a couple of them just so I don't miss anything that I think is important. But one of them that's really important would be the A tag. All right, so an A tag is called an anchor tag. This is basically a link that you can put in your website that people can click. So if I type in like go to Google, click save, notice that we get back some text that says go to Google. But if we were to look up this tag, let me go and search A. This tag also has some different attributes attached to it, right? The most important one that you want with an A tag is the href. All right, so typically you can do href, and then you can type in a website. So I can say like https google.com. And now if I go back to my site and click this with a command click so that it doesn't close my tab, notice that it loaded up Google. This tag, the anchor tag, is what we're going to be using a lot, especially as you build larger applications. You have pages that need to navigate to other pages that need to navigate to more pages. So you're going to be using this tag like all the time, to be honest with you all. And again, just read through these attributes if there's anything else. Sometimes you want it to like load up a new tab for the user when they click it. So you could do like target is equal to underscore blank. So I'll just add that attribute in there. And now when I click on it without holding down command, it's going to, oops, let me refresh my page. It's going to open up a new tab for the user automatically. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do. You just have to like kind of dive into the weeds of all the different ways you can do things. But I think that's a pretty good overview of the A tag. Let's see what else there might be. So sometimes you want to maybe style some text to make it like red or make it blue or something. There is a span tag that you can use to basically wrap different words or different parts of sentences to give them styling. Now, we're not going to cover CSS yet in this video, but just note that now if I were to inspect that word here in my free browser, notice that it has a span wrapping it. And what this allows us to do is later on, we can actually attach a style attribute to do like some inline styles on it. I'll just show you this right now since we're here, but I don't want to get too into this. Like I can make this text red by adding a style attribute, which is pretty cool. And then you can also add a class, another attribute called class, and I can name this accent or something. So what this is going to do, this again dives into styling in CSS. You can attach a class attribute to whatever tag that you want. And then you can write CSS style sheets to target those classes, right? So I could say anything that has a class of accent, I want to make it red. But we're not going to dive into that right now. But just keep that in mind that span is really useful for wrapping text or different areas of paragraphs or sentences to pretty much give like a custom style to it. I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of different tags you can learn. But again, I'm just trying to show you some of the basics. So one of them that's also important is an unordered list, right? So an unordered list is a tag that you have to nest another tag inside for it to work. So this one is you kind of have to learn two tags to understand this one. So the unordered list tag, the UL tag, you need to basically give it children that all have li tags. All right, so in this case, if I say like hello world, save that, that is how you get like the bullet point lists here. All right, you just basically do something like this. And then you might say, well, what if I don't want bullet points? Or what if I want like numbers? Well, you can change the UL, which stands for unordered list, and change it to an OL, which stands for an ordered list. And then that's how you get the numbers to show up. And you can actually take this a step further by nesting unordered lists inside of unordered lists, stuff like that. I could do stuff like this, where basically I have an order list, and inside of that, I have unordered lists. That is an interesting element / tag to learn. I'm sure there's some others out there that I'm missing. There's one more that I think is probably one of the most important tags that you need to know, and that is the form tag. All right, so the form tag is a tag that you nest other tags in, just very similar to OL, where you can define inputs inside of the form tag, and then that is going to basically do a request to a server when you click a submit button. So let me just kind of walk you through this. Hopefully all this other stuff doesn't distract you. So inside the form tag, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an input. This is another type of element, an input tag. And the input element is basically a way to draw an input box here. Okay, so notice here we have an input box. Again, this has a couple of attributes that are kind of unique. So one attribute is a placeholder. I can say placeholder and put like email here. And that is going to basically put that email text in the background of the input. So that's kind of important to know. There's also a name attribute you can attach to these. So I can say like name is email as well. And this will be useful when you actually submit the form to a backend. The backend knows like what input values came in. Like for example, if you wanted to make a form that tries to log in, well, you probably want to send an email and a password over to the backend, and the backend can look at the payload and look for email and look for password. We're going to cover that later on. But usually on a form, you also have something called a button tag. So I'm going to do a button here. And the button is actually something that requires you to nest some text in it. So I could put like submit here, click refresh, and notice that a submit button pops up for us. You can put whatever you want inside of this. I could put some exclamation marks and those will show up. But the purpose of the button is just a way to have the user click on something. So the button tag also has an attribute called type. And when you nest it inside of a form, typically you want to put submit. So what this is going to do is if the user were to click on this and press enter or click on the actual button itself, it's going to submit the form to the backend. So what does that actually mean? We're going to dive more into this, but I want to make sure I kind of cover it real quick just so you are exposed to it. So on the form itself, there's an attribute you can type in called action. And that action, you typically put like a URL. So I could put like, I don't know, https:/google.com. And when I click on my submit button, that's actually going to make a request to Google. But let's see, where's network? I don't know if this is going to be a good example. This might not actually do what I want. So if I click submit, notice that it actually kind of refreshed my page and navigated me to google.com, right? It did what we call a post request to Google, which happens to just put like name inside of the URL here. So it's kind of confusing. We're going to see this later on when we're actually dealing with doing interactions with the backend, like persisting data or doing a login form. Typically, you want to hit a URL that you have created on your backend. So I might have like a URL called /login. And when the user clicks submit, it's going to pretty much redirect the user to a login page or a login endpoint. We're going to look at their email and password, check it, validate it. And if everything's good, we might redirect them back to a dashboard page or something like that. Just keep that in mind. This is just super high level. I don't expect you to like really understand what's going on until we start building out some real functionality with all this. There's also another important one is a select. So there's a select tag. And inside the select tag, there's options. So I could do this. Notice that we get a drop down here. Let me comment out these for right now, just so we can focus. So we got a select tag with one option, okay? And I can copy and paste this a couple of times. And now we have a select with 4 options. There are other things you can attach to the select and options tag, like other attributes, but I just want to give you a good exposure to what this is. All right, I'm going to talk about one last tag, and then I'm going to kind of wrap up this video because I think I've kind of talked about 80 or 90% of all the tags you might use in your web application. The last one is something called a div tag, okay? Now, off the bat, this div tag, it doesn't really do anything, right? It just wraps your element inside of something called like a divider. So if I can try to find this in my elements tab here, you can see we have a div tag here. It really doesn't actually do anything on the screen. There's no width or height to it. What you can use these for is you can kind of wrap groups of tags together or groups of elements and then apply some type of layout or apply some type of styling so that you can change how the page looks. So one good example of what we do is if you wanted to like have all of this paragraph tag be to the right of this hello world stuff, you could probably go and you could just wrap all of this stuff inside a div. So if I wanted to wrap all of this stuff here in a div, and then also wrap my form and title in a div, just to kind of show you on the body itself, I can add like a style to it and say display of flex. And that's going to basically change the layout of the page. Now, again, this is like a more of a CSS discussion, which I don't want to get into yet. But just note that like divs are what we use a lot all the time when it comes to the layout of the page and maybe structuring how the page looks and just applying different styles to them, different classes to make the page look the way that you want. All right, so I hope this was a good overview of like how to get started with VS Code, what VS Code is, how you can create an HTML file, what these different tags mean, how you nest tags together to kind of build out a web application. We did talk about in the last video about like the tree structure of HTML, and I hope now this seeing like these tags built out on the screen helps exemplify that point that I made, that like we're just nesting children inside of children to build out a web page. And this is going to come into play later on with JavaScript when we need to like maybe grab our parent node or grab our sibling node or grab our children node. So the structure of HTML is kind of important to understand how it works. And really, you just need to memorize the syntax. So if there's anything you don't understand about HTML and like these brackets and like when do you do a slash ending bracket, definitely read up on it some more because we're just going to keep on building upon this and things are just going to get more confusing down the road. All right, so stay tuned for the next video where I'm going to probably talk about a little bit of styling and maybe we can actually build out an example like blog post page or something like that.